Hey, everybody. Sebastian Page has a high profile job in the high stakes world of finance. He is Chief Investment Officer at Rowe Price, overseeing a fund that manages more than $500 billion in assets. It can be a stressful job, not only for himself, but for the team he manages. Navigating that stress led Sebastian to studying the psychology behind decision making and executing at the highest level, similar to what high profile athletes must do when they're on the biggest stage. That research led to his book called The Psychology of Leadership. And today we talk about how people like you and me can use these tools in our everyday lives. Whether it's business, sports, or leading your family, I think you'll enjoy the practical elements we cover today as we talk leadership with Sebastian Page. I'm sure you have a very busy schedule given the role you have and all the things you have going. So thanks for jumping on. I definitely, a lot of things I want to talk to you about: your book, your career. I'm also intrigued to talk about where you grew up, because you grew up in Quebec, Canada. But
Yeah.
I read that your dad ran a large cattle farm as well as being a finance professor. So I'd love to explore that a little bit and understand what that was like for you.
Well, Greg, first of all, thank you. I'm fired up about this, and I love how you're starting asking about my father. He is now retired, but if you met him, you would recognize a workaholic. He
Hmm.
loves work in a good way. It's all about engagement and flow for him. So you can imagine growing up with a role model who's running a full operation, a cattle farm, which, by the way, not only is a full-time job, it's actually really hard,
Yeah.
especially when you do it on your own, and is a full-time tenure professor teaching finance, which is the industry I ended up working in. And my father, I talk about this in The Psychology of Leadership. He was he was really, for him, interested in work from an intrinsic perspective.
Mhm.
And we know from research that intrinsic motivation is much more powerful than any kind of external reward, like people telling you you're doing a good job. Anything that's good for your ego is
Mhm.
an external reward. For him, the work itself was the reward in a way, how it
Mhm.
made him feel. But as a teenager, you know, he
Yeah.
wanted me to go to the farm and help him put up fences and work all day and mow the lawn. I found that excruciating. I only realized years later that he was teaching me by example. He was just showing me the intrinsic value of work, how he felt at the end of the day. But it took me years. I was mostly frustrated as a teenager because I just wanted to hang out with my friends, not go
Yeah.
to the farm and work all weekend with my
Yeah.
dad. But it was
I
probably a critical time where it was a good time for him to teach me this.
yeah, I know those feelings. I said this in our correspondence, but I grew up on a dairy farm in Western Washington. So, I've lived that too, and it's only as I got older did I appreciate that, of how hard my dad and my mom worked, to have this way of life. And there's something about it, I believe, and I see this in my siblings, that it becomes part of your DNA. And although I'm not in farming now, there's something about the work ethic that comes from that it's with you the rest of your life, the way you approach things. And when you work on a farm, there's no getting up and debating whether you're going to work today.
Yeah.
The work has to get done, right? So, and it's just part of the way of life. And so, um, I have mutual admiration for my dad, who's passed away, but a hard worker, and learned a lot through that upbringing.
And growing up on a farm, another thing you learn is this sense of sovereignty. The farm is your land, it's your operation. Farmers are entrepreneurs. They own
Mhm.
their destiny. They work for themselves for the most part. That's also a philosophy. And you can imagine my father also being a finance professor,
Mhm.
being pro United States. He always loved and admired the US as a Canadian because he thought that's a country that values individual accountability and freedom. And he was teaching capitalism and financial markets. So you can see where I end up working in money management. But the thing is, no one believes me when I say I grew up on a farm. And
Yeah.
I'm this guy who wears suits and I can't really do any manual work. Ultimately, if a light bulb goes out, I'll say, "Oh, can someone change this?"
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
surprising sometimes when I say to people, "Yeah, I grew up on a farm."
Yeah, it's interesting. That's really two dynamics of your dad too. I mean, the finance and it feels like the farming side of it was really providing him something that he wasn't getting being a professor, right? I mean, his motivation, his reward was the work. It sounds like so he found reward in just doing the work, right? And there's something about that, like when you do, I don't live on a farm anymore, but if I do work around the yard or something like that, or I help my brothers and we do something outside that's physical, there is reward in that.
Yes, and it's an intrinsic reward.
Yes.
I reflect back at my first summer job when I had to do manual work for someone who ran a real estate empire. Maybe empire is a grandiose word, but someone who ran commercial real estate buildings in our city where I grew up. We were the maintenance crew, two-man maintenance crew, doing all sorts of manual labor. And there were some tasks where I would get engaged and time would fly. Other tasks where it would be impossible to see progress and I would just couldn't wait for the break. I was, again, fairly young. I didn't
Mhm.
have this intrinsic work ethic, but I just reflect back on those and I think about which tasks, what was it about certain tasks that made me feel engaged? And there's one thing in particular. Was I able to notice the progress I was making? That
Mhm.
made a huge difference in my level of engagement. I actually loved mowing the lawn because it's very finite. You get the feedback,
Yes.
you see how you're progressing. I hated doing things like cleaning the roof of factories where we could have worked for 30 years on these. We would have never made progress. You couldn't really notice even the progress you were making. There's a theory in the research of psychology of flow that's super important in sports. It's super important in positive psychology and somewhat underrated in terms of how you can apply it to leadership and business. Greg, if you run a survey in America now and you ask people, are you engaged at work?
Mm.
You get a very disappointing 80% response rate saying they're not engaged in their work. We have a crisis of
Mhm.
engagement at work. And thinking about the theory of flow and how you can apply it to setting goals and metrics and tracking progress and giving feedback actually can move the dial on
Yeah.
engagement. If you
Yeah.
show people the progress they're making, if you somewhat gamify it, the interesting part about the theory of flow is it's all about taking challenges that for which you have the skills, but that are just quite challenging at the same time. If you're outside the band, if you're doing something super easy, you're not going to be as engaged. And if you're
Mhm.
doing something impossible, you're also going to be outside the band for flow because you're going to get discouraged. So when I think about goals in my business and setting the milestones, I think about flow. I think about how am I going to get the team in flow? And there's a
Yeah.
lot more applications, but this is just an example. Flow is also a team process. Most people don't think about it that way, but teams can get in flow together like an orchestra. That's also a fascinating thing to use in
Yeah.
business.
Yeah. Yeah, we think about that in sports and there's so much crossover between sports and business and your book certainly, melds those two worlds together because There's so many similarities. Flow is one of them. You think about if Michael Jordan were to define flow, right? It's just being where the basket looks like it's 10 feet wide, and he's just moving through. And we can do that in other areas of our lives. And I think in business too. I think there's something about having a challenge and meeting that challenge, right? That encourages us to keep going, and that's part of what you're talking about.
Here's an underrated aspect of flow. If you go back to the original research by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, I'm probably not pronouncing his last name
Mhm.
right, but he's famous for having invented the theory of flow. In the original research, he talks about flow as a social concept as well. When you're having a conversation with someone, like we are right now, Greg, you can get in flow because your intellect is fully engaged, is challenging, you're getting feedback, you have all the elements of flow. When, as a team, we discuss, for example, investment decisions, sometimes I
Mhm.
just step back and I look around the room and I notice everyone is fully engaged. No one's keeping track of time. We're using our intellect to think about what's going to happen in financial markets. And I just look at it and see team level flow. So, how do you design processes to encourage teams getting in flow, processes to encourage people getting in flow? You can gamify some of the goals, some of the work. If you take that to an extreme, video games are kind of designed to get you in flow, to keep
Mhm.
going, to keep the challenge just in the right sweet spot where you lose track of time. Is generally a positive state of being. And in the long run, it's actually more powerful in your ability to thrive as an individual than just day to day positive emotion. I
Do
find
you
that fascinating.
I do too, and I especially today where I think we're distracted more than ever before. So in that meeting you're talking about, I'm assuming people aren't sitting there on their cell phones, scrolling through, but we are distracted constantly, and I think that interrupts flow or whatever you want to call it. I mean, even in our personal lives, right? Just you can find this in your personal lives, but if you're distracted, it's hard to concentrate on, the thing in front of you.
Distraction is the most challenging aspect, I believe, of work and of mental health and of teenage development in our country. We have an industry, social media, built on distraction. The activation cost to pick up your phone and get distracted is so low. It's so easy to do. And the little dopamine you get out of it,
Mhm.
the effect it has on your brain makes it addictive. And in modern society right now, if you're not careful, you're going to get addicted to your phone. And I don't want to pontificate too much about this, but it is important. And a lot of research has been done, and Jonathan Haidt is published on this, and it's super important. I don't want to go on a long tangent and be the older guy who's complaining about
Yeah.
phones and social media. There are positive aspects to it, but we don't realize how incredibly addictive these things are. And the algos are built using billions and billions of dollars in AI research. This
Mhm.
is the subtle way AI is being used to maximize the time you spend on this. Greg, I'm not immune to it.
Yeah.
I went on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube to start promoting my book, while
Mhm.
historically I hadn't been on social media that much. And I started scrolling last year, and I would just start using it, keep my head down, and then get my head up and realized 3 hours of my life had gone by.
Yeah.
And I just thought, "Wait a minute, this is not this is I have other things I can do that are more productive. Exercise, read, spend time with my family, spend time." So many things are more productive. And I got worried. I got worried about it for myself. And at the turn of the year, I decided that I was not going to scroll. And maybe you can say it's a little bit, you know, hypocritical because I'm actually promoting my book on those platforms. I watch a post when I open the app, but
Yeah.
then I move on. I just don't scroll anymore.
Yeah. You have to be intentional. I think that's the difference. And I don't think you're preaching from a soapbox here. And there's plenty of studies. We all know it's a distraction, but I think, and this ties into the book, is if we're intentional with our actions, right? These different things that we'll talk about in this conversation, that's where the progress is. We're not, I'm not saying you can't have a phone, you can't have an Instagram account. You have to be intentional when you're on there because it'll suck you in. I mean, I try to be an example for my kids and I find myself on it. It's like,
Yep.
like that's hypocritical, right? So it is, and it is being intentional. And I want to ask you about the book. I just want to take a step back because I've read it and I really enjoyed it. And I liked on this podcast, we talk a lot about business, we talk sports, and your book is
Yep.
tying all those things in. And it's a book on leadership. It's called The Psychology of Leadership. And I wonder why you use the word psychology. There's different words you could use. You could use strategy. There's a lot of different things. I think we're getting a glimpse of it in our conversation already, but I think you were intentional with that word, and I wonder what the premise was behind that.
I love that question. No one's asked it yet, and I
Oh,
love
good.
that you ask it because authors, we agonize over titles. And then in this industry, when you get others involved, like agents and
Mm,
editors, then you agonize even more over titles.
mm,
I will tell you that an original title for the manuscript was The End in Mind. And in the book, I talk a lot about longer term goals and working backwards and just how thinking with the end in mind can bring more resilience in your day to day life. It was a not so subtle nod at Stephen Covey from the famous book, The Seven Habits. One of
mhm.
the habits is begin with the end in mind. So, how do I end up with psychology? First of all, the book is about research in psychology, sports psychology, also positive psychology, and personality psychology. So, it is the common thread in the book. I will also admit to you and your listeners, and the author knows and the editor knows, that I was so impressed by the book, The Psychology of Money by Morgan
Mm,
Housel.
yes, great
And
book.
we happen to have the same editor and the same publisher as he did when he wrote that book and published it.
Okay.
That was a little bit of an anchor and a nod or homage at Morgan Housel. I thought just the psychology of leadership.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to emulate or follow up on that book, but there's definitely a nod there because he took psychology and applied it to something that you typically don't apply psychology to, which is money. But here's the most important thing for me with this title. We think of psychology in society as treating clinical issues, which is super important: depression, anxiety. We don't think enough about the positive side of psychology. And it turns out about half the research in academia that's done nowadays is on the positive side. How do people thrive?
Mhm.
What makes people happy? How do you reach high performance? What about ultra high performance? What's the psychology behind all these things? And that's fascinating research, right?
Yeah.
What makes people happy? What a broad, interesting question to dig into. And what does it mean for business leadership? And by the way, you read the book. Leadership is much more than just business leadership.
Mhm.
Everyone's a leader. You're a leader in your family because
Mm.
people look at what you do and they try to emulate. You lead by example. You're a leader in your community. Whether you want to be a leader or not, people take their cues from you, especially as you grow in your own life. So it's a long-winded answer, Greg, but I love the question. Why using psychology in the title? We think so much about titles. I just want to give you the example that I like to use to
Hmm.
introduce the power of the positive side of psychology. It's Felix Baumgartner. Does that ring a bell, Greg?
No,
Felix
I don't
Baumgartner?
know. That doesn't ring a bell. Who is that?
So it's interesting because he's actually not that famous. He passed away recently in an accident, but in 2012, he did something absolutely amazing. And as I retell what he did, some people in the audience and you might remember this. In 2012, Felix Baumgartner got in a little aluminum capsule tied to a giant helium balloon
Hmm.
on his own and went up 24 miles to the stratosphere to the edge of space.
Yes, I do remember
Does
this.
that ring a bell, Red
Yeah,
Bull?
I didn't remember his name, but yes.
And then he did something unbelievable. He jumped out
Yeah.
from space and he skydived for 24 miles. He fell for 10 minutes, 4 of which he was free falling. And he didn't know if it was going to pass out. No one had ever
Right.
done something unbelievable like that. He's the first human being to break the sound barrier without an aircraft.
Yeah. Wow.
What an amazing feat. Well,
Yeah.
it turns out Felix Baumgartner, throughout his training, including in the day of the event, he had a sports psychologist coaching him.
Yeah.
And so if I give a talk somewhere, I like to start with this to say, okay, you understand psychology to treat anxiety and depression. Do you understand how psychology can push you into high performance, into thriving, into ultra high performance? So I like to use that as an intro, Greg, when I.
Yeah. I think the correlation there, again, tying in sports is we've had a lot of authors on here written about running. I'm a runner. I run marathons. I've lived it. I understand the power of the mind when it comes to endurance sports. And I coach cross country. I talk to my kids about it. I've lived it. I've seen it firsthand. So positive attributes of a strong mindset, so I understand exactly where you're coming from, and it applies to all these elements of our lives if we want to apply it. I'm curious as to, clearly you're a deep thinker. You have this finance job that's
Yeah.
many hours a week. Maybe you're a little bit, you're like your dad. You find these
Yeah.
different avenues, but you become a writer. You write this book. What sparked you to write the book, and then how'd you find the time to do it?
I love those questions as well. Those I get often.
Yeah.
I was stressed at work. And not only
Hmm.
was I stressed at work, but I was stressing about stressing. I kept telling myself, you've been doing this for 25 years. How can you be stressed right now? You know how to do this. And so I ended up talking to a sports psychologist, and he introduced me to the mindset behind ultra high performance. His name is Dr. Daniel Zimmett. He lives in
Hmm.
Maryland, where I live. He also happens to be an athlete. So he's a PhD sports psychologist. He coaches NFL players, Major League Baseball, Olympic athletes on their mindset. But he also personally holds 40 national titles in the sport of handball. This
Hmm.
is the sport where it's kind of like squash, but you're whacking the ball with
Sure.
your hands.
Hmm.
First time I meet him, he tells me the story of his best match ever, which happened 10 years prior. He remembers everything about it. He
Sure.
remembers where the ball was on point 7. It hit the
Hmm.
back wall, then the side wall, and he's getting emotional. He goes, at some point I was on my knees and I made an extreme shot that I didn't think I could make. But then, kind of nonchalantly, just matter of fact, he goes, I lost the next 2 points. And I interrupt and I say, look, you lost that match and that's your most cherished match as an athlete. And yes, it was his way to introduce me to something interesting about sports psychology. It's not about winning.
Mhm.
Sports psychology is about losing and what you do with the losses and the opportunities for growth. For him,
Mhm.
that day on the court, as a sports psychologist and an athlete, he realized that forever he was able to play the game at a much higher level because he was playing a much stronger opponent. So that was the introduction for the mindset. Now, being obsessed, not obsessed, but passionate about writing, it's an activity that gets me into flow.
Mhm.
And being a research nerd, where in quantitative finance and economics, always read a bunch of papers and understand the mathematics behind how we manage risk in financial markets, I gravitated towards research papers on the academic side of psychology. And I just felt like I was discovering a gold mine and kept thinking, why aren't we talking about this in business? There's so many applications. So, Greg, I ended up writing on Saturday mornings, 3 hours at a time. And my goal was 1,100 words
Mhm.
per week. Often on Sundays, I would finish up with an hour or two, but that was it. 1,100 words, about 3 hours on Saturday mornings, and a little bit on Sundays, but very consistently.
Yeah.
If you do that, it doesn't feel hard at all. And then before you know it, you have a wonderful manuscript. Then there's work with editing, and it's a quirky industry that I had to
Yeah.
learn by doing. But so it's an important message in the book towards the end where I talk about the personality trait conscientiousness.
Mhm.
People think you can't change your personality, you're born with it. Wait a minute, you can. Only 40% of personality traits are inherited.
Mhm.
Conscientiousness can be trained and practiced through small habits. Writing the book for me was a relatively small weekly habit. I had
Mhm.
my little reward where I would enter the number of words in the spreadsheet. I had the cue, it's on Saturday morning, therefore I need to write. And in between the cue and the reward, I had my habit. So if your listeners have read the famous books by Charles Duhigg or
Mhm.
Atomic Habit,
Mhm.
is kind of a follow-up book by James Clear, they'll know small habits, little bit at a time, lead to unbelievably big results.
So those are a couple of things that we've already talked about that you're tying back in is intentionality, right? Consistency. So you're very consistent in doing that without being distracted. You committed to doing it. And then the intrinsic motivation was hitting those 1,100 words, right? And the flow and the momentum that comes with that. So then you start doing it every weekend, and it really comes from consistency in, again, it ties into sports and business and life, right? If you start and you continue, you may make mistakes along the way, but that is, it feels like that consistency is really what led to getting to the end and getting a book put together.
And people think it's hard. It's not hard if you do a little bit at a time,
Yeah.
consistently. It's not hard. And like many, many, many things in life, results that look extraordinary just require small, persistent daily habits. This is why James Clear's book is an absolute bestseller. It's like compound interest in money management.
Hmm.
It just adds up and compounds on itself. I like how you talk about intentionality, Greg, because I don't talk about this directly in the psychology of leadership, but I have a strong view that either you run the day or the day runs you.
Hmm.
That's how I think of intentionality. My job is stressful. I want to spend time with my family, and I need to run the day and not let the day run me. And this applies whether you're a senior person in an organization or whether other people are telling you what to do. You still have probably more control than you think. This is what I do when I get to work. I have a list that I update every week about the important things I need to do. Basic list at the top of the page. Then in the morning I pull up my calendar and I'll have meetings. We love meetings in business.
Hmm.
I'll have meetings, but I'll
Yes.
also have blocks of time. And I tend to schedule meetings to allow for blocks of uninterrupted times. This is
Yeah.
not easy for everybody, but
Right.
I've reached a point where I can do that. I have the list of tasks on my sheet of paper, and I decide for myself that I'm going to run my day. I'm going to be intentional about what I want to do at what time during the day. So I go 7:30 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. I look at my list of tasks. It's the morning. It's when I'm most activated personally. I drink
Yes.
my coffee and I'm more productive in the morning.
Yes. I'm the
I'll
same way.
I'll try to take the tougher tasks. I'll write them down. And then 10:30 to 11:30 I'll have a meeting and so on. And I have this schedule handwritten for the day that to me sets the intentionality and try not to let the day run me. And there's no time to scroll on your phone for 3 hours when you do that.
Yeah. When we think about leadership, you've done a lot of research. What what traits, do the best leaders share in your research?
Oh, what a great question. So, in the third part of the book, I talk about personality psychology. I use the model called the Big Five. There are 5 personality traits that are well described in this model. People use different models in business. The Myers-Briggs is very popular, but the Big
Hmm.
Five is the one for which we have the most research in academia. There is research that will tell you statistically which personality traits are most correlated with leadership success. And there's a subtlety there because leadership success can be described as getting the promotion. But then there's in-role success. Once you've climbed the ladder, are you successful as a leader? Sometimes the personality traits don't help in the same way. So let's play a game, Greg. And I'm sorry if I put you on the spot. You can
Okay.
decline to answer, but I just want to play a little bit of a guessing game with you. I'll give you personality traits,
Okay.
and you tell me if you think that those correlate positively, if they contribute to leadership success in general. And we'll focus mainly on getting the leadership job. Now, I got to say before we do this, the highest correlations are positive 30%. This is not set in stone. Personality is fluid, but
Hmm.
there's something there that generally helps you become a leader. So the first trait, we're going to start with the trait that everybody knows. It's introversion versus extroversion. What do you think the research says? If you score high in extroversion, if you're an extrovert, it means you get energy from social interaction. It
Right.
generally means you like to talk. It generally means you're quite comfortable being put on the spot,
Right.
like I'm doing for you right now.
Yes. My first response, I mean, it seems like it's extrovert, but to me, it feels like it's introvert because I think to be a good leader, you need a lot of self-reflection. I think that's probably that probably overrides it. So I'm going to say introvert.
So you're an optimist. There's subtlety here. It's actually 30% correlated if you're extroverted. So there's a positive correlation between being extroverted and being promoted into leadership positions. You know what? Because
That's getting the promotion because you're extroverted.
that,
So your
yeah,
personality, your inner people notice you. So it's
exact.
about if we're talking about getting the promotion. I understand.
You're
Yeah.
less, hesitant about self promotion,
Yeah.
and you
Yes. Which
speak
is
well
big.
in meetings.
That
Now,
makes sense.
now you actually, however, are correct in that in role, introverts, research shows, make wonderful leaders because you're right, they're more self aware, but also they're better listeners.
Hmm.
Listening is an underrated super skill for leadership, very counterintuitive. You think it's about you as a leader, not at all. It's about
Right.
how you make the team better. And how do you make the team better? You understand them, you listen, and you absorb, and then you help. So there's subtlety here, but generally, if you want to get a promotion, you can act, even if you're not, you can act more extroverted and it's going to help you. The other trait I'm going to put on the table for you to debate is conscientiousness. This is
Hmm.
a desirable trait. It means you show up on time, you're organized, you do what you said you were going to do. What do you think? Positive or negative correlation? By the way, if you score low on conscientiousness, you might have really good qualities like the ability to improvise, act fast, come up with 80-20 solutions. But generally, conscientiousness means you're quite disciplined.
Yeah, I would say that's a positive.
Absolutely positive. It's one of the three, there's 3 out of 5 traits that correlate positively with leadership success, and
Hmm.
conscientiousness is one of them. Next
Hmm.
one is openness. Are you open to new ideas, new experiences? Do you
I would say,
seek
yeah, I would
novelty?
say that's a positive.
That is a positive, and that is the third one. So we talked about
Hmm.
extroversion, we talked about conscientiousness and openness, because as a leader, you need to drive change. So you have to have an open mind about new trends and seek new ideas. Other traits, agreeableness. Interestingly, the correlation is not that significant either way. Agreeableness, are you a people pleaser or are you able to disagree with people well? There's a little bit of a positive correlation because as a leader, you need to make tough decisions and sometimes
Hmm.
you have to be disagreeable. In the book, I talk about picking the times strategically when to be disagreeable. Neuroticism. So, are you an anxious person? Do you tend to worry about things before you find out the outcome? What do you think, Greg?
Man, I would say, oh, for a leader, probably yes, that's an attribute. It may not be good for their health, but they're they're thinking about the problem, so therefore, they're spending time on it.
So there are 2 aspects to this response. There is one that is very counterintuitive again, and I love to talk about counterintuitive findings in the psychology of leadership.
Mm.
This one is that stress can actually increase performance in general, in sports, for
Yes.
example. If you're a runner, you need to run a marathon. If at the starting line, you've got adrenaline pumping, you're activated, you're a little bit anxious about how it's gonna go, you look
Mhm.
at the other runners and you really wanna do well, you're gonna get a better time than if at the starting line, you're completely relaxed and at a 0 stress level. So you learn that from sports psychology that stress up to a point,
Mhm.
after which it becomes really bad for you, but up to a point is gonna help your performance. If your surgeon is about to perform complicated surgery, you want them fully concentrated, fully prepared, and you want them to be a little anxious about it. They're going to do
Right.
better.
Right.
However, now the other side is that in leadership, you actually need to be calm under pressure because people take their cues from you.
Mhm.
And especially in business leadership, but also in sports leadership, is very stressful. So, in the study of personality traits, neuroticism was the only trait that actually had a negative correlation
Hmm.
leadership success. So,
Mhm.
all else being equal, it was negatively 30% correlated with leadership success because there is a need for leaders to be calm, remain calm under pressure.
Yeah.
So I realize I gave you 2 answers. One was, yeah, you're right. Neuroticism or stress can increase performance. No, you're not. This research shows it had a negative correlation. First of all, none of these things are set in stone. It depends
Mhm.
on the lens through which you look at it, and it depends how you use your neuroticism.
Yeah, I think it's good to point those things out because a certain, like you say, a certain amount of stress is good for you. I mean, is good for your performance. And so if you think about in business, you have a big presentation coming up, right? You're a little bit nervous before you're studying. You're thinking about you're going in, you're gonna try and sleep well the night before because you want to perform. right? If you don't have any stress about it, you might be kind of sloppy in the presentation. So you don't want to be too stressed where you're stumbling over your words, but a certain amount of stress in business, certainly in sports, with the example you gave, it definitely helps with performance. If it can take you to that edge and you know how to manage it and navigate it and stay calm under pressure while doing that, that's when you can get into flow in that regard, I would think.
Absolutely. And guess what? Going around in life at a stress level of 0 is not going to happen to anybody.
Right.
That's part of human condition. We're wired to feel stress for survival and for many reasons. Look, I want to be clear that excess stress, if you look at your cortisol levels, they have
Mhm.
negative health outcomes. It will impact your sleep, your appetite, your immune system, your sex drive, your concentration. But there's an optimal functioning point. And sports psychologists like to reframe the stress as activation, which is a more positive way of processing what's happening to your body when you're feeling stressed. Greg, there's something called the Yerkes-Dodson curves. I
Mhm.
became absolutely fascinated with those. There's about 80 years of research on them. Some of it is controversial in academia. It's been debated, but the concept is very clear. It's a curve, an inverted U, and it maps performance, say athletic performance, with your level of stress. Or sports psychologists will be careful to call it something else like activation, but let's call it
Mhm.
stress.
Mhm.
And it's an inverted U. As stress increases at the beginning, performance increases. Then it reaches an optimal point, and then after that you choke and your performance deteriorates.
Yes.
And I discovered that the Yerkes-Dodson curves are different for different types of activities, and they're of course different for different people. We all have different curves. If the task is simple, a 100-meter dash, or even running a marathon is straightforward, extremely difficult, but straightforward, not complex,
Mhm.
then you are going to reach optimal performance at a higher activation level. Take a 100-meter dash. If your adrenaline is pumping, your heart is beating, you're nervous about how you're going to run the 100-meter dash, you're in the competition, people are standing next to you, they're waiting for the same gun, you're going to run much faster than if you're completely relaxed about it.
Right.
That's been studied ad nauseum in the sports literature. If the task is more complex, like archery, you'll reach optimal performance, the top of the inverted U curve, at a lower stress level. Not 0, but at a lower stress level. And that's why before you pull on the string and release the arrow, you need to bring yourself down a little bit on that curve.
Yeah. Yeah. It's shooting a free throw, right? In basketball.
Yep.
It's that in baseball, it's that moment, in the ninth inning, are you going to be focused? And in business, there's plenty of examples. It's like you're being asked some hard questions, but can you stay within yourself to answer it correctly? Or you have to, in your business, I mean, and I'd love to ask you about this. You're making some very, high intense finance decisions throughout the day that could have some big repercussions.
Yep.
Are you, have you trained yourself through these studies to be highly focused, yet calm in making those decisions?
In several ways. One is on the spot when you feel the stress. I used to think the breathing exercises were kind of cheesy, not really working, just something people say. And then I started studying it and I read the book Breath by James Nestor.
Mhm.
And I realized that Michael Jordan, Shaquille O'Neal, Kobe Bryant, they all had a breathing coach. And I thought, okay, wait a minute, there's something to this. So
Hmm.
in the stressful moment, whether it's a stressful decision or when I go on live national TV to debate financial decisions we're making in front of the world, and I don't know the questions they're going to ask, there are ways to bring the stress down almost immediately through breathing exercises. And it's much more powerful than I thought when I started doing the research on this. And then in practice, it's really working well for me because you can do that anywhere. I'm I'm on this in the studio in CNBC and no one's
Hmm.
noticing, but I'm doing 4x4 breathing.
Hmm.
I'm inhaling for 4 seconds, holding it, exhaling for 4 seconds, holding it at the bottom for 4. No one's noticing. I'm doing this for 30 seconds, 60 seconds before I go in the air, and it helps me tremendously.
Hmm.
But the other aspect of it, Greg, goes back to what we said earlier about how sports psychology is about losing. If you talk to sports psychologists, they're much more interested in what you do when you lose and how you handle your losses. I like to use the example of Roger Federer to talk about this mindset because it helps me to handle tough, stressful decisions, to think about the fact that, yeah, I'm going to get some wrong,
Hmm.
and to live in the uncertainty that you're going to get some decisions wrong. That's very important in investing. So Federer, when he talked to the students at Dartmouth, it was a commencement address. Did you catch this? It was about a year and a
I
half
did.
ago.
Yeah. I
He
did.
went,
Please go on. It's great. It's
it's
great
amazing.
material.
He went completely viral, and people
Yeah,
listening
he
to
did.
this, you can find it online because it just caught on. He said that as a pro athlete, as one of the best tennis players of all time, he played 1,500 matches and won 80% of the matches. Not surprising. He's one of the
Hmm.
best tennis players of all time. But then he looked at the students and asked, what percentage of points do you think I won? And it turns out it's only 54%.
It's incredible.
So Roger Federer, one of the best tennis players of all time, lost almost half the points he ever played. He just had a small edge.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. But what's most important is what he said afterwards. He looked at the students and he said, whatever game you play in life, you're going to lose. Get used to it. And then he said, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, the best in the world are not the best in the world because they never lose. They're the best in the world because they know they're going to lose again and again and again, and they've learned to deal with it.
Mm.
And he looked at the students and he said, you have to learn to adapt and grow. So when I'm making stressful decisions, I embrace the fact that I'm going to make some mistakes. And instead of doing what human nature kind of wants us to do, which is sweep the mistakes under the rug, I spend more time thinking about them, whether we followed the right process, even if the outcome was unlucky, or whether we were lucky, even though we didn't make such a good decision, which happens as well. And just separating luck from skill and embracing what I can learn from getting something wrong.
Yeah. And not getting swayed too much by a negative outcome, right? So the tennis player that smashes their racket because they lost a point and then they lose, 6 love from their out, they didn't recover, right?
Yeah.
So it's about bouncing back from those losses or those, setbacks. In your book, I thought really appreciated that you talked about keys to happiness because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about psychology and the positive attributes, right? And you talk about engagement and relationships, and that is such a key point to, again, both our personal and our professional lives. If we feel engaged with those we're working with or living with, and that there's relationship there, the wins are celebrated together, the losses are taken together. And I think feels like in environments where you have that engagement, that's where the most fulfillment comes from.
You can summarize positive psychology with an acronym. Now, Greg, I got to say, I don't like acronyms. I work in business. I get PowerPoints every day with too many acronyms,
Yeah.
especially if they're from the technology team. But everybody, too many acronyms. But for positive psychology, there's one that I love, and I use it in the book, and each letter is a chapter. The acronym is PERMA, PERMA.
Hmm.
It's from Marty Seligman, the father of positive psychology, academic researcher. PERMA stands for P, positive emotions, which is what we try to seek every day. We seek positive emotions. IRMA is where people thrive in the long run. And the most important part is it's unrelated to positive emotion in a way. In the long run, it is, but in the short run, it feels different. E stands for engagement. R stands for positive relationships. M stands for meaning. And
Mhm.
A stands for long-term accomplishment. This sounds fuzzy and positive thinking, kind of. But when you dig into the research and you look at what it means for managing a team, either in sports or in business, you find that it's incredibly practical. If positive relationships are so important, why don't we spend more time in business improving how we handle the feedback process? Feedback process is a big part of what we do in business when we evaluate performance.
Mhm.
Well, why don't we take a positive relationship point of view to that? And by the way, positive doesn't necessarily mean just being nice to each other and always agreeing, because then if you do that, you're not really performing as a team and you just become passive aggressive.
Mhm.
But if you look at positive relationships from the lens of the feedback process, how can you build trust and mutual respect and improve how people process feedback? That's also cherished by athletes. Athletes love feedback.
Mm.
People in business, not so much.
Right.
Not so much. So it's just an example. And meaning is a buzzword in business, but there's so many ways you can increase meaning in your team. First of all, talk about it. We just don't talk about it enough. What's the
Yeah.
meaning of what we do?
But I think
Um,
a good leader, thinks about or affects people on the way they feel. You know what I mean? It's the way they make other people feel, and a good leader is doing that through, the various things that you're talking about, certain levels of engagement, certain levels of feedback, finding a way to do that properly. And if people feel engaged, um, if they feel like you care about them and they're getting meaning out of what they're doing, it's a more positive experience and environment. So it does tie into, I guess, what I'm saying is the way a leader makes a person feel.
and yes, and on meaning is a big part of it. Here's
Mm.
something I do when an analyst does some work for me. I take the work, I go to an investment decision-making committee, and we make an important decision. After the meeting, I send a note to the analyst and I tell her how her work influenced an important investment decision. Thank you for doing this. We ended up deciding to increase our allocation to international stocks based on your analysis. And now they get much more of a sense of what the work is about. I love to use the analogy of the three bricklayers. It's the story where the architect walks to three bricklayers that are doing the exact same job. He asks the first one, "What are you doing?" The first one looks tired. He says, "I'm laying brick. It's really tiring." Then he goes to the second one. The second one looks a bit more engaged. And he goes, "I'm a wall builder. I'm building a wall." Then he goes to the third one. And the third one's working really hard and smiling. He goes, "What are you doing?" And the third one says, "I'm a cathedral builder.
Mhm.
I'm building this awesome cathedral." The three of them are doing the exact same job. They just have a different sense of meaning.
Yeah.
In my business, I can walk to three analysts working on a spreadsheet. One might say, "Oh, I'm just debugging this spreadsheet." Another one might say, "Oh, I'm trying to find a way to outperform financial markets, to do better." And then the third one might say, "I'm finding ways to make money for our clients so they can enjoy better retirement, send their kids to college, pay their bills, have better financial security." three levels of meaning again.
Yeah. Yeah, meaning and perspective. And you talk about perspective in your book. You also talk about burnout and the
Yes.
burnout that you faced. I mean, you've learned the hard way. I think a lot of us have, but I mean, you're flying all over the world. You're grinding. You're burning the candle at both ends. And this is long before you wrote the book. But I mean, through trial and error, I think I'd love for you to talk about burnout, what you've been through, and how you manage it today, because you haven't necessarily slowed down. Maybe you manage time differently, but burnout's a big thing for people. And I
Yes.
think the more we can help people with that, the better.
I call it goal-induced blindness.
Mm,
This is a topic that's researched in academic psychology. It means that when you're so obsessed with your goal, sometimes you will forget about important things that aren't directly related to your goal. The example used in the literature in psychology is Mount Everest. If you want to summit Everest, you have a 4% chance of dying in the process, statistically.
mm,
On Mount Everest, there's plenty of goal induced blindness. Climbers know they should quit, they know the weather's turning, but they're just so obsessed with their goal that they're going to keep going. In my case, I almost died in 2005. And I believe it's because I was physically, mentally exhausted. I was working nonstop. I had major goal induced blindness. I was traveling the world. I didn't know what time zone I was in. I lived in Boston at the time. I was so exhausted. I wasn't eating well either. I just was not taking care of myself. And I thought, okay, I'm going to take control here, and I decided to go run outside and shock my body. And I didn't know it at the time, but something really bad happened. Couple days later, I started shaking, and then I started getting a fever, and then pain in my abdomen. I took a couple Advils. I was away in Canada. I drove back to Boston, and then it got really bad. A fever spiked. I ended up at Mount Auburn Hospital in Boston, spent a week there. It was very hard to diagnose what I had. Ultimately, the doctors think there's a bacteria. When I went running and my body was completely run down to begin with,
mhm,
I had some cuts on my toes. There's some bacteria of the strep family that entered the bloodstream and started just just hurting my abdominal muscles.
mhm.
At the end of the week, the infectious disease specialist came by and he said, we gave you so many antibiotics. Some of them weren't available 5 years prior. If we hadn't had those, you wouldn't have made it.
Wow.
And, that was a moment where I thought, okay, I got to start taking care of myself.
Mhm,
And I learned that day. It took me many years to find the balance. And now, Greg, it's really simple for me. I want three things to work together: sleep, diet, and exercise.
yes.
Rest is super important in all of this. But if I can hit those three reasonably well, I'm not perfect. You're a marathon runner. You know the importance of sleep, diet, and
Yeah.
exercise. It's just so important for preventing burnout and rest. I pontificate with my team now. If I find out someone's not taking their vacation days, I'm going to tell them, please, please, please take your vacation days. I came across the example recently of Simone Biles.
Mhm,
It happened a few years back, but I started reading on it because it's such a good story. At the Tokyo Olympics, she was so overworked that she developed the twisties, which in
yeah.
gymnastics apparently means that you can't find yourself when you're flipping in the air. And it was a stress response and being overworked. And she famously walked out of the Tokyo Olympics. Now, I like to say, if you read this story, she came back and won a bunch of gold medals in the
Right.
US and at the World Championships. I like to say, because it's true, Simone Biles became a better gymnast by watching Netflix on Sundays.
Mhm.
She writes about how she learned to rest, build rest into her routines, and ultimately get more sleep, and tweeting about, "Oh, I just got 8 hours of sleep." And she became a better gymnast. You're a marathon runner. You know your training schedule.
Yeah.
It goes up, and then there's a week of rest,
Yeah.
and then it goes up again.
Yes.
That's how life works. And
Yeah.
so if you don't build rest into your regimen, it's just not gonna succeed in the long run.
Yeah, you just burn yourself out. On the Simone Biles thing, I will also point out she took some criticism when that happened. It's a great story now, but she
Yep,
took criticism for ultimately advocating for herself
yep.
and what she did to bring, mental health to the forefront in athletics and everyday life. She's applauded for it now, but she took some heat from some people, and I don't want to go without saying that because I think that was a big thing. Okay, so last thing here, because we're wrapping up, and there's so much good content. You can tell, like, I love this topic, and these things. That's why I appreciate you being here and being the book you wrote. What have we missed? Is there anything we've missed? Because I want practical things that people could take away, because it's easy to talk about this, and um, we're talking about consistency in little steps. Maybe what are the little steps people could take in their everyday lives to become better leaders, or and just find that sweet spot of more fulfillment by a commitment to consistency.
I'll give you a very simple takeaway. There are 18 principles in the book, but if you ask me the most important that cuts across that we haven't talked about today, think long term. Most of us do not think long term enough. We get stressed out and bothered
Yes.
by day to day setbacks. We don't set up a vision of what we want to do with our lives long term. And it just puts everything in perspective. Stoic philosophers even like to think about the fact that they're going to die one day. And that sounds depressing.
Hmm.
But if our listeners just take one nugget away here, yes, the power of habit, yes, learning to lose, yes, everything we talked about, but if you just ask me to give one, I would say most of us are not in the habit of thinking long term enough.
That's great. I could not agree with that more. I could not agree with that more. There's so much. You'll put the phone down, right? Because time is valuable. And I think you probably learned that too from your illness, from, dealing with the pressures you've done with that. Time is a precious thing. And I think when you think long term, you value time even more. Would you agree?
Yes, and you increase your sense of meaning because now you have a long term mission, you have values that are aligned with some long term goal. You can bring in the habits too, because you know your small daily habits are going to lead to big results in the long term. And because you're thinking long term, you're going to go through the daily annoyance of keeping discipline in exercising or whatever the daily habit is. So it's remarkable how it ties in together a lot of concepts we talked about today.
Well, I appreciate you joining, Sebastian. I'll put a link into the book and your LinkedIn. I know that's a great place for people to follow you. Is that probably the best place for people to find you?
Yes, I'm super easy to find there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know you're a busy person, and I was so thrilled when we connected and could set this up. I enjoy the book. I recommend it to people, and keep doing what you're doing because it's meaningful, and I think it has an impact on people.
Thank you, Greg. I had an awesome time in the conversation today. And I'll say the same to you. You keep doing what you're doing. It's a wonderful podcast.
I appreciate the feedback. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.